Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We've got participants from around the globe that are tuning in today for this event, and I want to welcome everyone to GMF's on Turkey series. Today's event, this virtual event, is focused on the impact of the coronavirus pandemic on polarization in Turkey. And my name is Jonathan Katz. I'm a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund. I also direct GMF's Frontlines of Democracy initiative in Washington and work very closely with my colleagues in GMF's Ankara office and our office in Brussels, and focusing on Turkey, U.S.-Turkish relations, transatlantic relations with Turkey, and other key challenges. So first and foremost, I just want to welcome everybody here. I hope that everybody is safe in these unsettled times, and we deeply appreciate you joining us for this conversation. Obviously, the coronavirus is front and center for everyone around the globe. It's a global challenge. Turkey, in particular, has faced significant challenges. It's become a hot spot, unfortunately, and our condolences and thoughts are with those who have been impacted by this in Turkey. And sort of looking at the numbers, even as of the last 20 hours, Turkey, I understand the death tolls over 100, confirmed cases are over 40,000. And those are the figures released by the health ministry in Ankara. So those are the reported figures. On the positive side, which is really hard to, Turkey has also been engaging its government in a positive way in either sending or selling protective equipment to dozens of countries, including in the Balkans, Spain, Italy, the UK, the US. I even saw even reports of transactions with countries like Israel. And so it's critically important at this time. And, as the Turkish government is stepping up to address these challenges, its generosity, both obviously its focus first domestically, but also internationally, is important. We really are, deeply appreciative to have our speakers here today. And I just wanted to, just in terms of instructions for everybody, just walk you through. Many of you have been through these events, but this event we will post hopefully by video after. All participants will be on mute except for those that are speaking. So you can see us on video, but we can't see you. When we get to questions, we'll ask that you use the Q&A function. Many of you participated last Friday, and so you know how to use that. But we'll explain this later if there's any questions. What we'll then do is, beyond that point, after the opening speakers give their opening statements, and then a round of questions will open it up to you. So thank you so much, for joining us. I'm going to turn to, hopefully everybody has seen, we have Andrew O'Donoghue with us, Emre, Erdoğan, and then also Lisel, Hintz, all experts in many ways, both in the issues of polarization, of issues of identity politics, experts in Turkey and Turkey's relationships with the West. But today for this conversation, we're going to be focusing on polarization and the challenges, primarily domestically, but how the coronavirus has impacted politics. And I think part of that right now we know is that there's an impact now, and there will be an impact down the road. But we've also seen in some spaces governments really stepping up to meet the challenges, working across the countries that they represent, working directly with local leaders, national leaders, groups, civil society. And so Turkey, which is in the midst of obviously a very challenging situation right now, and really maybe a hot spot right now for this challenge. We're going to really go into the conversation about what's taking place. And first, I'm going to start off with Andrew. And I'm sorry that I'm not reading full bios, but since we're doing this virtually, hopefully everybody's had the time to sort of click on links and make certain that they know who's participating today. But first, I want to turn to, if I can, to Andrew with the first question, and really for your opening statement as well. And one of the things I did beforehand was send a few questions to get us moving in the right direction. Andrew, I know that you and Tom Carruthers have co-edited a book called Democracies Divided, the global challenge of political polarization. And you've written extensively on the subject of polarization, including a focus on Turkey. We're in the midst of a global crisis with the coronavirus impacting citizens globally and in Turkey. Of course, there's an immediate impact, and then there's going to be long-term fallout of the coronavirus, which will be significant. In Turkey, you can already see a country that was hit hard economically in 2018 has been struggling to come out of that economic downturn, but will likely experience another economic downturn, unfortunately. But that's just one of the impacts. So what is your general assessment of the state of political polarization in general, that is also likely to impact Turkish politics as well? What is your perspective of, as a student of and sort of an expert looking at polarization, how do you see the coronavirus impacting this issue globally? You've written extensively about a number of countries, but Turkey's been a focus. And I just want to thank you all again, all the panelists for joining and taking time for being here. So Andrew, I'm going to just turn it over to you. Then we'll turn it to Emre. Then we'll turn it over to Lisel. Thank you.
First of all, let me say it's a pleasure to be joining, and thank you very much for convening this very interesting discussion. As also to echo what has already been said, I hope that all of you are holding up as best as possible under these very difficult circumstances. So with that in mind, I think your opening question sort of leads to two different lines of thought. One is, how has polarization affected the pandemic? And how has the pandemic itself affected polarization? Now, before diving into those questions, I think that it's crucial as sort of a starting point to establish a common understanding of what we mean when we say polarization is severe or intense, and what we mean when we say polarization is increasing. So in the book you just mentioned, Democracies Divided, Tom Carruthers and I draw upon a definition of severe polarization offered by a Turkish scholar, Murat Somer, and his collaborator, Jennifer McCoy. And their definition highlights that polarization isn't just a matter of how ideologically far apart political parties are. Instead, polarization is severe when a single overriding division splits both politics and society into two opposing blocks. And what's crucial is that individuals' political preferences become a matter of social identity. So that is, voting for a given party isn't just about preferring certain policies, but rather about belonging to a certain group. So when we talk about polarization increasing, for example, in this crisis, we really mean that these identity divisions among ordinary citizens and among politicians are becoming more and more bitter. So how has polarization, I guess, affected the pandemic? I would say it's clear now that polarization is one factor, albeit among many, that has undermined governments' responses to this crisis. So countries afflicted with severe polarization, such as the United States, the United Kingdom, and of course, Turkey, are on balance responding less effectively than their polarized neighbors. And that's, we would argue, for three primary reasons. So first, we highlight in the book that polarization corrodes the functioning of apolitical state institutions that are really essential to good governance. So in polarized countries, political parties regularly attack institutions like anti-corruption bodies, central banks, judiciaries, and seek to use them as weapons in partisan battle. So as we've seen in many countries, the state bureaucracy becomes tainted by nepotism and corruption because political loyalty is the primary criterion for hiring and promotions. So you can probably all tell, all of this weakens a country's ability pretty severely to grapple with the current pandemic. When a political party has hollowed out state institutions or publicly disparaged authorities like the CDC, it's much harder to make the machinery of government work in a crisis. Now, a second point is that in polarized societies, government institutions suffer from an acute lack of trust. And this is something that Emre's work has shown in the case of Turkey. Faith in government institutions is similarly very divided and partisan. In other countries that we study in the book, such as Poland, for example, 75% of government voters say that they trust the parliament, whereas 85% of opposition voters say that they distrust it. And this lack of trust poses a pretty grave problem when you're trying to control a pandemic, because governmental societal control, asking people to stay inside and so much more, demands a lot of voluntary compliance from the society, and it can't just be a matter of government enforcement. So in Hong Kong, for instance, 60% of the population distrusts the pro-Beijing executive. And then when the government attempted to impose a national quarantine, what we saw was striking nurses and even violent opposition to those quarantine rules. A final point is that in polarized societies, there is often significant friction and opposition held states or municipalities because both sides want to gain some sort of partisan advantage by demonstrating their superiority in governance. These clashes between local and national authorities can slow or confuse a crisis response, and that's something we've seen in the United States, in Hungary, and of course in Turkey. There's a second question that I think your sort of query raises, and that is how the pandemic has affected polarization. And to that, I would say it's far too soon to tell. So Tom Carruthers and I are currently actually working with the case study authors from our book, Democracies Divided, on a follow-up collection on how the pandemic is in fact affecting political divisions in countries around the world. But I think it's possible now to highlight at least two brief points. The first is that health crises are having differential effects along key axes of polarization, whether it's rich versus poor, urban versus rural, region versus region. And consequently, it may sharpen those political divides. As the crisis worsens, the opposing sides might disagree about the gravity of the pandemic and what the appropriate governmental response should be. And inevitably, one side may accuse the other of having blood on its hands. So the second point is that we are only now, and I think this is something you gestured at in your point about the economic issues, is that we are only now seeing the initial first order effects of the crisis. So coming soon, we're probably going to see a second and perhaps bigger wave of political change and acrimony caused by an economic recession worse than any since the 1930s. In the most recent global financial crisis, we saw that these changes ushered in the rise and spread of a liberal populism, and it's unclear now what the coming economic devastation may bring. So in short, I would say polarization seems to be exacerbating the pandemic, at least thus far, and the pandemic itself seems likely to exacerbate polarization.
Thank you for that opening, and I think really certainly important. And I think in Turkey, obviously you can see very publicly some differences between, for example, mayors of big cities versus the approach of Ankara. No different than than what you're seeing in the United States too, which is different approaches between governors of states and President Trump and the approach to response. Emre, I want to bring you into this conversation. Excuse me. You've conducted multiple surveys on political polarization in Turkey. You've written recently for GMF, which I would recommend everybody here to read that. Can you talk a little bit, and I know you have some slides, just talk about some of your key findings, but I really thought your article that you wrote for the On Turkey series at GMF was really interesting at sort of carving out some different groupings and how they might be impacted. I also think that you talked about the potential for society to come together at this moment, but also very much likely the opposite. Some of the things that Andrew mentioned too, which is, the polarization. And Turkey already had deep polarization, which you're going to talk to us about, so I don't want to steal your thunder. And so those fault lines were already extremely exposed in Turkey and have, largely driven sort of politics, including last year's local elections and the results of those local elections. So you're dealing with a lot of factors in Turkey, and I'm going to turn it over to you to talk about the different fault lines, but also some of your key findings, which I know. And so hopefully, I think our tech team has worked with you to get these slides up and running. So hopefully it will work out well. Emre, over to you.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you for this live discussion. John, can you show our first slide? I want to follow up the argument of Andrew. Yes, there are different definitions of polarization, but what we are using is a kind of affective polarization, and it's about distance between the supporters of different political parties. In that slide, these are major political parties of Turkey, and you can easily see that each constituency has a significant other. For AK Party, this is Kurdish CHP and Republican People's Party. For Republican People's Party, this is Kurdish HT people and the government party. For the HDP, this is the same. We fail to find anyone who has an otherized people. That's why we focus on this social dimension, this identity dimension of polarization. Next slide, please. When we are operationalizing polarization, we are focusing on three different dimensions. The first one, ironically, this is social distance. This is not social distance we know, we learned nowadays. This is a concept forwarded in 1920s for measuring distance between different societal groups in the United States by famous social psychologist Bogardus. The second one, moral superiority. The belief that or attitude that you are feeling your group homogeneously superior to other groups. And the last one, this is the most important one, this is political tolerance or intolerance, a tolerance towards others. Next, please. Next slide, please. Here you can find some findings. You can see that, for example, 50% of Turkish society supports the supporters of other political parties should be supervised by the state for security reasons. Another significant issue is that a significant part of population believes that children of the supporters of other political parties should not attend same schools with their children. This is another indicator of social distance. And more than 50% of participants say that supporters of the other political parties couldn't be candidates in elections. It's the withdrawal of political rights. This is the highest level of political intolerance. That's why it's very important. And next, this is important, somewhat sophisticated. As Andrew said, it's related with identities. And here you can see that these are leading identity groups in Turkey and their affiliation with political parties. You can easily see on the north of the map, there is CHP, Republican People's Parties, which is close to Alawis, secularists, and Atatürkists. In the southern part of the map, you can see that there is a coalition of MHP and AK Party. The survey was conducted before the presidential elections when there were not that kind of political alliances, but these alliances was already formed on the constituency basis. You can see that Turkish people, conservative people, nationalists, these are grouped all together. And on the other part of the map, you see the HDP, the Kurdish party, which is associated with Kurdish people, supporters of the Gezi movement, and minority groups. It's very important, this map shows that identities are grouped along party lines, and there are not too many coinciding identities. It's something big. That's why there is a big wave of political polarization in Turkey. It didn't happen in one day. All these cleavages were existing in Turkish society, but our political system, our elections and referenda and other style of everyday referenda, they created this situation. They created that kind of deep cleavages, and all these cleavages are reflected in the political scene. An important point here, I need to state, we conducted this research in 2017. Before these elections and before these local elections of last year, picture might be changed. I don't know. We are planning to conduct another survey to understand what happened after the emergence of an alternative, quote-unquote, democratic bloc in Turkey. This is the situation in Turkey. at the beginning of the disease. And I don't know, as Andrew said, it's too early to make some speculations, but we need to understand that what will happen will be within the boundaries of this map. This map is the product of 10 decades, I can say, for instance.
Emre, thank you. I don't know if there was anything else you wanted to add beyond the slides, but if that's where you want to stop, we're going to turn to Lisel. Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you, and thank you for that. I think that last slide is really really important in terms of political party alignments. Of course, Turkey's elections, even for presidential elections, because it's a presidential heavily weighted presidential system, is not for several years. But we know that obviously what takes place now and how it might impact elections, for example, in 2023, is a different story. But I also appreciate that social distancing was in vogue as a term used in the I think it was the 1920s. That I don't think I knew. Lisel, can I just turn to you? And I know from your perch as a professor at Johns Hopkins University that you're a close follower of identity politics, and particularly in Turkey. And what can you tell us, just sort of even building on what Andrew and Emre have said about both political fault lines in Turkey and how different actors are approaching them, given what's taking place right now. And I know you're looking at various groups within Turkey, including those that are vulnerable. And of course, I think when you're looking at some of the reporting coming out of Turkey, there's been some criticism of the government from various groups about the response. But there's also groups that are vulnerable in this circumstance. So I'm hoping you might be able to touch on sort of identity politics, but I also know you're following these different parts of Turkey. And of course, as we move to the next round, Emre or Andrew, please jump in. But maybe you could speak to that as well. And you have been a long time follower of what's taking place from Washington, but also through your own research, through your own writings, including books. So please, maybe if I could just turn to you and to address some of these challenges. And if there's anything that you wanted to respond to what Emre or Andrew said to start us off, please do so.
Great, thank you so much, Jonathan. Thank you to everyone for joining us. I hope everyone is doing okay out there. Thank you to the organizers. Thank you for adding me to the original lineup. I'm very happy to be speaking with you guys. So I think in terms of the question of polarization, we do have to think about the government's performance. And I think this is something that came up very clearly in Emre's piece that he wrote for GMF in terms of how people will evaluate the government's performance. And in terms of what the Turkish government has been doing, Turkey has, in the last couple of days, had the dubious honor of having the highest number of newly diagnosed cases. That, of course, has to do with testing. The more tests you do, the more cases you're going to find. But we also know that the Turkish Medical Association has had problems with the way in which Turkey has been reporting the numbers. If you look at the way that the AKP has responded to the crisis, I think we can look at it from two different perspectives that are important for understanding how vulnerable populations are affected, as well as how individuals will evaluate the AKP's performance. So the first is, how did they respond? And the second is, how were they using this crisis to consolidate their power? So I'll start with the first one. In terms of how the government has responded and some critiques that have been made of that I do think are going to be long lasting, again, as Emre's piece suggests. The fact that there was a long period in which the government was denying that there were any cases. A lot of people were pointing to the wonderful powers of Colonia and, the fact that maybe Turks are immune to this. There was some underreporting of cases that was going on there for sure. The fact that the government has been relatively slow in terms of announcing or mandating particular procedures. So right now we don't have a lockdown in Turkey. You have a curfew for those under 20 and those over 65. And so basically what you have is those who are of the majority working population are not in a lockdown. The question is, you know, how are people supposed to feed their families if the economy is really contracting? What are people supposed to do? The fact that there hasn't been a complete lockdown, I think, is something that is going to be evaluated in the future. We certainly know that Istanbul Mayor Ekrem İmamoğlu has been calling for a lockdown. He's been saying, you know, too little, too late. We need to have much stricter measures. So there's definitely, you know, without İmamoğlu directly or in any sort of, you know, vicious way calling out the government, it hasn't been anything like that, but he's certainly been suggesting that we need a lot more attention to this. He's also had problems with the government blocking some of the funds that his municipality had raised in terms of donations. That the state-run Vakıfbank has been blocking those funds when a national campaign of donations was announced. So in terms of the response, it has certainly been found lacking by some of the political opposition, and there's concerns about how that's going to affect the contagion rate. In terms of, just very quickly, vulnerable populations, I do think we need to think about you know, the number of Syrians that we have in Turkey, those who are living in very close quarters, those that don't necessarily have access to you know, some of the abilities to prevent this kind of transmission. I think you really have to look at populations that are already under siege, in a sense, in Turkey from an identity perspective. Those who are saying, you know, why did we spend $40 billion on these Syrians? Why are they here? Why are you asking for my money now? In terms of the response to the donation campaign that the government launched, you saw a lot of people saying, well, why did you give that money away to others? So the fact that, you know, not all, but a lot of Syrians have access to medical care as part of their temporary guest status is something that's also caused a lot of resentment within the Turkish population. So this is exacerbated by the coronavirus pandemic. In terms of women and domestic violence rates, I think this is something we really need to look at. So domestic violence has already been a huge problem in Turkey. It has increased exponentially in short periods of time. In March of 2019, I think in Istanbul alone, we had something like 1,800 cases of domestic violence. And again, that's what's reported, not what's actually taking place. And in March of this year, we had 2,500 cases. So that's like a 38% increase in domestic violence in 1 year. You know, when people are told to stay home, women don't, and anyone who is abused doesn't necessarily have the opportunity to get away from their abuser. So those kinds of problems are extremely concerning across a number of aspects of the political spectrum. If there is maybe one highlight or bright point, the government had been in its deliberations about which political prisoners, or excuse me, not political prisoners, which prisoners were going to be released from jail to try to prevent outbreak within the prison system. Women's groups stepped forward and said, we don't want sex offenders and those kinds of individuals to be released. And so there was a bit of rethinking of what was going to happen there. But there's still a lot of people concerned about abusers being released and going back into the home, and women essentially having nowhere to go. So that's a huge element as well. Just very quickly, again, in terms of how the AKP government is going to be evaluated on its performance, the slip of the tongue that I made earlier, I think, is indicative. The sense that those who are going to be released do not include any of the, say, 50,000 political prisoners, including Selahattin Demirtas, Figen Yüksekdağ, Osman Kavala, and many, many others. So a lot of people have been saying that that is clear politicization of this. The fact that some of the measures that had been in place during the state of emergency in the post-coup era are back in place. So those in the prison system can confiscate lawyers' notes after they speak with their clients in prison. The fact that just yesterday a new draft law was introduced that will go to the parliament next week about having a local representative for social media companies. So Twitter, Facebook, those kinds of platforms that are already heavily regulated in Turkey may have to answer to a local representative in terms of authorities' concerns with the content that's being shared on that platform. And if they don't answer, they get a fine or they get their bandwidth cut. So, you know, there's definitely a sense that the AKP is using this opportunity to consolidate its power. Yesterday, we saw an announcement from the Ministry of Culture and Tourism that NGO meetings need to be banned, including those that are held online, which doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense to a whole lot of people. So I think just, you know, in terms of how the AKP has responded, both with the social distancing measures, the economic packages and so forth, which again, you know, new opposition member, Ali Babacan with his new party is saying those economic measures aren't enough. He obviously, former economic guru, one of the few that sort of walks out clean from his AKP experience. So in terms of the measures that are taken, there's a lot of opposition members that are saying that these are wanting and that they're criticizing the fact that the AKP seems to be using this as an opportunity to consolidate its power, as we know that other authoritarian regimes have been doing. So I think there's a lot of concerns along those lines.
Well, Lisel, thank you for that. I think you sort of touched on a number of the fault lines internally in Turkey and a number of different spaces where one pointing to some things where the government might be doing something that is in the right direction, or what people perceive as some in the opposite direction in terms of concerns. And I mentioned before this mayors and political parties versus each other in the sense of how that response should, you know, what that response should look like. And I did want to turn to, you know, just sort of building on this because I think Turkey, when sort of looking at it, is facing so many multiple challenges. It was already facing a refugee challenge. It already had an economic challenge to try to deal with before the pandemic hits, an ongoing conflict in Syria as well, and then, you know, unresolved internal tensions and fault lines. Emre, if I could come back in and just maybe ask you about sort of responding to Lisel's points about how you think the Turkish government is managing the pandemic, and how do they prefer to manage it? Because it seems that, you know, some of the things that have been pointed out, which is issues such as, you know, maybe pushing back against those who are critical of the government, including, I think, the social media issue, which you raised on Twitter, YouTube, is something that sort of has broken sort of in national and sort of international news over the last 24 hours. But I'm wondering if you could, and you did this within the context of what you wrote recently, and maybe if you could speak to that. And then also, I want to bring Andrew in on this as well, because I wanted to ask him whether or not, as he and Tom and others are looking at a space like Turkey, whether good governance, you know, matters. And might that be one of the things that, out of this entire pandemic, as we see around the world, countries that were prepared and ready to address this challenge, and I don't think there were many that were really truly ready, that populations might want, out of all this, may come out not just maybe polarized, but maybe perhaps wanting more government and better government to respond to these types of challenges. And I think many people believe this won't be the first the last pandemic, that we're going to be facing a number of these challenges going forward. So Emre, maybe you could just respond back to Lisel, and then to my question, and then Andrew, if we could bring you in right after that.
Thank you. It's a very important point, because it's not unique to Turkey, first of all. Turkey is one of the earlier countries which is experienced that kind of change, because during the last 2 years, Turkey experienced a significant change in its political system. Now, Turkey is a presidential system. And from that perspective, it's a kind of experiment, because to my knowledge, there are a limited number of countries who switch to presidential system from a parliamentary one. It's very important. And the logic was that, the argument was that under presidential systems, the government was expected to act more effectively or efficiently. This issue of efficiency is very important. It's something different than a good government. It's something acting fast, minimizing costs, especially economic costs, and development is very important, not in terms of human development, but increase in gross domestic product or that kind of economic indicators. The logic was that they thought that the Turkish people ask a strong government, because they argued that, advocates of this change, they advocated that parliamentarian system was limiting the powers of the government, and that kind of change will strengthen the government to face with the crisis. It's very important. This change was prepared to face with a crisis, and it's a crisis. That's why I believe that we need to focus on these characteristics of Turkey. First, Turkey is a presidential system, and the president and the government has limited, they don't have the supervision of the parliament. The parliament is almost meaningless in this context. And the government developed a kind of division of labor. The Minister of Health, in fact, he's acting as a Secretary of Health, as in a very American style, is in the charge of the governance of this crisis. He's an MD, he's an enterprises, and he's a kind of technocrat. He's not a typical politician. And Erdoğan, the leader of the country, has the political responsibility. And some people said that there are some problems between them, but I don't have specific information. But it's a kind of intervention of companies. It's very similar to that kind of entrepreneurship stuff. We are intervening to the situation, and we are trying to solve the crisis. This is the argument. And they are giving regular reports, but not by cooperating with other entities, civil society organizations, or opposition, or other parts of society. They are only briefing the society. They are only making that kind of briefings, and they don't make that kind of cooperation with other societies. Yesterday, Amartya Sen, famous economist, wrote a piece about how can we manage this crisis, and he said that we need collaboration. In Turkey, we don't have collaboration. This is one party, one man, one government rule. That's the game. We will see. It's early to discuss about the results of these policies. We are not sure about numbers similar to other countries because they are not collected randomly. Yes, we will see at the end of the crisis, and we will have a chance to judge the performance of the government. This is the situation. It is early to judge the government, but we won't judge only the performance of the government. We will also judge the performance of the new political system. At the end of the day, of course, all these judgments won't be objective. Polarization will continue, of course, and we will have tendency to favor our beloved ones. We will tend to support our parties and judge everything from that very subjective and biased perspective.
Thank you for that too, and I think it's a good segue to Andrew too, just on this point of lack both of collaboration, but also governing models, and I think Andrew, you're looking across sort of looking at a number of countries right now and their response, and I think one thing I think you can't necessarily do, even though I think that perhaps the Turkish governing model is closer, maybe what people perceive is closer now to less democratic, more closer to, I don't know if it would be, it's not the same as Russia, it's not the same as China, but what Emre said, which is this leadership and decision-making in the hands of one sort of one leader, small cadre of officials around sort of a lack of maybe of transparency, of accountability, with a parliament that no longer is a check and balance. that maybe thinking more political needs versus needs of citizens. Can you just maybe speak to that too? If that's what you're saying, where do you put Turkey in that respect, and President Erdoğan and the government's approach, and I think Lisel mentioned too this issue of prisoners being released, who's being released, who's not. One thing that was mentioned was we've heard about political opponents or press not being released as part of the government's decision making. Andrew, can we bring you in on this?
Yes, and to follow up on these sort of excellent points, I think that what the coronavirus crisis has shown is, first and foremost, that there's a sort of a global crisis of governance. But I think also, as sort of Lisel was saying, in the Turkish case, what we're also seeing is a crisis of the media. So let me talk in a little bit sort of about both of those 2 points. I think to your first question, it has become increasingly clear that having a democratic or an authoritarian regime is not the most important factor determining how quickly or intensively a country has implemented preventative measures. And I think another interesting point you raised is whether more personalized regimes are more likely to sort of waver in terms of implementing harsh economic lockdowns that would sort of really negatively affect the economy. I think the answer to that is no. There are many other personalized regimes like Xi Jinping's regime in China that have responded quite well. I think that governance is the crucial issue here. And as Rachel Kleinfeld at Carnegie has argued, another one is just a state's level of capacity and public trust, which is far more important than regime type in determining the quality of responses, at least thus far. So according to the polling firm Edelman, one thing that's very interesting about China is that it is far and away the country that is most trusted by its population in the world. Singapore ranks 6th and South Korea is in 10th place. So I think what these countries have in common in their ability to effectively respond to the pandemic has not necessarily been that they are less personalized. China is extremely personalized. It's not that some are autocracies and others are democracies. Sort of we see a range of outcomes across these different regime types. It's really state capacity and public trust. Another question, unfortunately, is whether as an matter of international perception, we need to be worried about the narrative that democracies are inferior. But that's a separate question. To get to a second point, though, I think to pick up especially on what Lisel mentioned, this pandemic, I think, needs to force a reckoning with the fact that the news media and our systems of political communication are so dysfunctional that they've now become effectively a threat to public health and national security. And I want to say quickly a brief thanks to Michael Wurz, Alan Makovsky, and Max Hoffman, who I believe are in the audience, for sort of helping me sort of develop my thinking on this. But 2 points about sort of the Turkish context in particular, and how the media, I think, has been absolutely decisive in inhibiting an effective response to this crisis above and beyond the crisis of governance. So the first point about the media is that, as many of you know well, the distrust toward the Turkish media has just reached crisis proportions. The Center for American Progress commissioned a study in 2018 that's nationally representative, and they found that upwards of 2/3 of Turks thought that the media mostly presents biased and untruthful information. And Lisel touched on this when talking about the HDP and pro-Kurdish political groups, but among Turks who voted for the opposition HDP, over 90% thought that the media is mostly untruthful. And the problem is precisely that Turks are right about the media, and misinformation in this pandemic has just become absolutely rampant, both on social media and on other news sources. So one, I think Lisel mentioned, is the sort of conspiracy theory that Turkish genes might make people resistant to the virus. Other stories have suggested that home remedies like unproven drugs and even hair dryers are effective virus cures. And other stories have suggested, for example, that even Coca-Cola was spreading the disease and threatened to spread panic. So the state of the Turkish media, I think, is really crucial because it is so at odds with the need to communicate clear and evidence-backed instructions to the public. Another issue about the Turkish media that we've started to gesture at is just how it is so partisan and fragmented that it has been unable to hold the government accountable for its policy failures and to push for a more positive and effective government response. So even into late March, A Haber and other pro-government outlets were praising the official response as an example to the world. And of course, meanwhile, the government has acted to shut down critical voices in the media. One anecdote I think was previously mentioned was a truck driver saying in a viral video that it's not the virus, but your system that will kill me. And he was detained within days. So I think it's not only a crisis of governance that we're witnessing, but a crisis of the media, its inability to deliver reliable information to the public, and its striking ability to cut the government off from receiving criticism about inevitable policy missteps. So I think those two issues, a lack of public trust in Turkey and a dysfunctional media environment, have really been driving this crisis.
Lisel, can I bring you into this too, just on those last points? And I think the challenge of independent media, independent voices, you know, it sounds to me, I think you had mentioned before too, maybe perhaps this is the moment when you need, you know, civil society. This is the moment when you need others with voices that are working with the government to share information. Do you see the same distrust and sort of, you mentioned just in terms of how the government is managing, you know, this process? Maybe you could just come in sort of building on Emre, but also Andrew too. And Andrew, I appreciate very much your breakdown of, I think there's a narrative of authoritarians versus democracies that's floating around out there, that, you know, who manages these, you know, something like a pandemic best. And I hope at some point you'll delve deeper into why Chinese public actually trust their government, because there was a lot of pushback internally in China by the Chinese public initially when the virus broke, and you had some really brave doctors in Wuhan that tried to send up a warning signal about the virus itself, and that initial response there wasn't really managed in the way that it should. But there's also in China a lack of independent media and a strict censorship of social media in a very significant way. And it reminds me a little bit about what Lisel said earlier about maybe an attempt to try to rein in social media as an independent source for Turks in the country. And it sounds to me that there's already a challenge with media in the country. And if you remove or restrict even social media, you'll actually take it down a further notch in terms of information sharing. Lisel, can you jump in? And also, just before we turn it over to you, the Q&A function is up for everybody to please weigh in right now. I can see there's a couple of questions already in the inbox to be addressed. But first and foremost, Lisel, let me turn it over to you. We expect and we hope everybody will ask some questions. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. No, I appreciate Andrew bringing up the point about the media. I think both in terms of news media and social media, this is an incredibly important conversation. It's also important to think about what kind of regime type we're looking at when we look at Turkey. And in political science, you have lots and lots of different measures for assessing that. I would say that the consensus among political scientists is that Turkey's regime is somewhere between a competitive authoritarian and a personalistic authoritarian regime. And that is measured along a whole set of criteria, from the consolidation of power in the executive to the oppression of civil society, journalists, things like that, the existence or non-existence of public freedoms, and whether people are able to engage in freedom of expression and freedom of assembly and all those good things. And as we've seen, certainly since 2013, the Gezi uprisings, and even more so since the coup attempt in 2016, you've seen very much a contraction of the space for civil society. So Jonathan, you were mentioning that a little bit earlier. The role of civil society can be to be a little bit of a check on the government, to lobby against the government, to push for particular policies, to try to advocate for particularly marginalized groups. One of the dynamics that you see in authoritarian regimes, particularly in which the party in power is not necessarily as stable as it would like, that is, that it sees threats to its power wherever it looks, whether it was the Kurds in 2015, whether it is new mayors like Ekrem İmamoğlu and Mansur Yavaş, who are getting support based on the actual job that they're doing in their mayorships, even though they've been challenged by the government. So when you see civil society organizations and the media and other elements that in a democratic regime or system should be checks, should be ways of communicating ideas to the government as threats or as disloyal enemies, then you're not getting that kind of feedback that you need. So there's an exit voice loyalty dynamic going on here, whereby the government is not necessarily, I mean, it's not really interested necessarily in a lot of that feedback, I would argue, but again, that's shaped by this sense of polarization. The sense that it's an us versus them system, whereby if you're not with us, if you're not supportive of what we are doing as the party in power, then you are not necessarily part of the nation. You're not part of, you're disloyal, essentially. So the media, plays a big role in this, of course, and it's not surprising to see the distrust of the media that came from the Center for American Progress report. It's important to understand the media landscape structure in Turkey, in the sense that 90 to 95% of the media is either influenced, owned, or controlled by the AKP through a complex structure of holding companies that have media outlets that they own, but also construction interests and banking interests and financial interests and political interests and all that kind of stuff. There's also an immense amount of self-censorship that goes on. One of the concerns now is that that self-censorship is going to trickle over into social media, particularly if, again, you have a sort of local representative that has to be accountable to the government for Twitter, for some of these other social media platforms as well. Part of the draft law also says that content has to be held within Turkey. There's concerns that the government is going to use that to gain information on people. So there's a lot of concerns about the constrictions on both the media itself and the structure that has become in terms of the political and economic interests being intertwined, but also of social media. We've seen licenses needed for streaming platforms. So there's definitely been attempts to contract the space for opposition in social media, and I think you're seeing that even more now.
Thank you, and just a reminder that these laws, we're seeing this in a number of countries where whether it's social media or laws like this being proposed in the sort of the fog of the coronavirus, that under the pretext of the need for a government to respond, that they need to fully constrict. And so this is not just, this is certainly a fallout of the coronavirus in a number of countries, and it leaves citizens certainly in many spaces vulnerable, specifically those that are at risk if they don't have the right information, or if they're, as was pointed out before, that there are sort of rumors about what works and what doesn't work in response to the virus. We have several questions right now, and we're gonna cut through. We're gonna start to sort of go through the round, and I just want to thank everybody for asking these questions. Is it Ceylan or Özgür? One of you two will be reading?
It will
Ceylan,
be me,
okay.
Jonathan. Thanks.
Thank you.
I will just read out the questions. And the first one is from Menekşe Tokyay. And the question follows as, how do you evaluate the corona diplomacy Turkey pursued throughout this process vis-a-vis its allies, but also countries like Israel, by providing them with medical equipment? Do you think such humanitarian assistance will help in reducing polarization in Turkey's diplomatic relations as well?
Okay, I think Lisel, do you want to try to tackle that, and
Sure.
And then others, please, Emre, if you want to as well. Lisel, let's turn to you for that first question.
Sure, yeah, I appreciate the question. I've been talking pretty pessimistically about what happens during a crisis and how governments, and it's certainly not just Turkey. If you look at what Viktor Orban is doing in Hungary in terms of the powers that he's been consolidating as well during a crisis. So we know that in certain cases, crises can in fact bring different nations together. You'll hear things like earthquake diplomacy. that can help bridge borders. Certainly Turkey has been the beneficiary of this, has reached out to other countries in times of crisis. So you can see some of those dynamics. Unfortunately, they don't last very long. This is not like a long-term bridge building, solidarity building. This is an immediate thank you for the assistance, thank you for helping me in this time of crisis, but it doesn't necessarily provide, at least from my anecdotal reading of a lot of these forms of, crisis diplomacy, let's say, or helping. Crisis diplomacy means something else, but in terms of trying to provide assistance during these times of need, that you don't see a real deep internalization of more amicable ties, and that the next time that there's a need to whip up nationalist rhetoric in order to get a few more political points, that governments are not necessarily hesitant to do so. So I'm not very optimistic about, I think it's great, some of the outreach efforts that we're seeing, but I don't see that as a long-term solution to some of the very deeply entrenched, less than amicable relations that Turkey has with some countries. So I don't see it as a long-term solution.
Thank you for that, because I think it's important. There's a lot of, and I'll maybe Andrew and Emre too. I mean, Emre, I was going to ask how, when you're looking domestically in Turkey and how Turks view, this type of an effort in terms of providing equipment, needed equipment externally to other countries. Whether or not that actually has an impact on how the public is viewing, the actual response. Because, in the U.S. in particular, this is one of those things where I think the emphasis has really been on making certain that that government, government communication is focused on the internal within the country too. And so I wanted to bring you in to talk to you a little bit about that, because I think it connects to the perspective of how people view governance in this moment and sort of decision making. And then Andrew too, just on the issue, I mean, you mentioned China before. There's a lot of concern that some of the response of governments has been about, like Beijing, coming from Beijing, has been about propaganda, an effort to kind of whitewash the impact of sort of the initial virus and the weaker response people perceive in Wuhan initially. Also that it's more propaganda ploy than it is supportive, including with some equipment, for example, from Russia or elsewhere that's not usable. And I'm just wondering too, I think so that question of what you're seeing in that space, and sort of government's responses, does it really matter to publics? And this is sort of building on sort of the question of Emre too, publics beyond that their government is seen as being responsive to the global side of this versus the domestic. And I just want to say, just on the U.S. side and EU and other Western partners, they are providing assistance, and they're thinking a lot about long-term assistance, including macroeconomic support. And I can see the planning taking place in the U.S. right now for this. But maybe, Emre, if I could bring you in on that Turkish public view, and then Andrew on that sort of that wider perspective globally.
Yeah, it's very
over to you, Emre.
Yeah, it's very sophisticated, and I will try to keep it short. First of all, we are trying to explain the rise of populism with a tension between cosmopolitanism and nationalism. And from that point of view, multilateral organizations or supranational organizations such as WHO and United Nations and other institutions failed to respond to the crisis. And now nation states are in the game, first of all. It's a kind of narrative. And there will be competition between different nation states about the capability, about the capacity to govern this crisis. It's an important part of the nationalistic myth. As a friend of ours wrote recently, this is the rise of nationalistic populism. All governments, they are trying to act as nationalistic way instead of multilateral way. Secondly, Turkey has always a problem of syndrome the Turks, they are admiring European institutions or cosmopolitan institutions, but they are also in the competition with these institutions. This is observed in international relations, this is observed in literacy, in football, etc. Everywhere. There is a competition with the West. And it's a good narrative to sell to the nationalistic segments of society. And we are raised in that way. We are socialized in that way to believe that, okay, Turks are superior to other countries, but because of blah, blah, blah. It's a very strong narrative. This is not unique to Turkey. Almost everywhere in the east of Europe, in Hungary, in Russia, in Poland, you can find that kind of narratives. And all these nationalistic populist countries, they will play these cards. All these diplomatic efforts, they are very valuable because we need cooperation. We cannot fight with virus alone. We need other countries, we need other scientists, etc., etc. But it's a good narrative to sell to Turkish people. We are going well, we are better than them. I believe that we'll listen to that kind of narratives nowadays.
Thank you. Andrew, can you pick up on this theme?
Yes, absolutely. So I think first I would agree absolutely with Emre that this reinforces a global nationalist narrative of needing to put XYZ country first. But on the question that you raised about whether this really matters to voters, whether their country is responsive to this crisis globally, I think that the answer has to be no. When we look at surveys of the Turkish public, the American public as well, foreign policy is almost never the most decisive voting issue for people in Turkey, at least. And I think that when we look back at this crisis and voters think about holding their political parties accountable or not, the issue of whether or not the country played into this nationalistic narrative is going to be extremely far back on voters' minds. On the second point that you raised about the issue of China's propaganda and whitewashing, I think that really in this situation, China's greatest asset is not its propaganda, but the failed United States response. So I think what's clear is that as we think about a global narrative about whether democracies or authoritarian regimes performs better during this crisis, most people will not look at countries like South Korea. Most people will look at the world's foremost democracy, the United States, and compare it to the world's foremost authoritarian regime, China. And I think that in that respect, China has performed better. It's pretty clear that even though China suppressed doctors and did all sorts of terrible things in terms of whitewashing this epidemic, the crisis is, if there were some sort of major crisis brewing under the surface to the extent that existed in the United States, it would not be possible to cover that up with mere propaganda. So I think that China has certainly whitewashed its response, but that it has performed better. And I think that that's worrisome for the broader narrative about democracies versus authoritarian regimes, simply because many people will make the facile US-China comparison. So I think that in that respect, China's propaganda is not the main factor as much as it is the failure of governance, the media, and the response in the United States.
Thank you for the last point. I just want to make sure that when we talk about response, even in the US, there's a local response, state responses, and if you look at recent sort of polling and sort of looking at sort of US, you see that governors, in particular, a number of governors, Republican and Democrats, much more highly rated in terms of their own domestic response versus that of the federal government and of President Trump. So we have a number of other questions. Ceylan, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Jonathan. Normally, I would read all the questions in order, but I see that two of the questions are alike in the pipeline, so I will read both of them. One of them is from Galip Dalay, and it follows as, it seems that the main political contest will take place between mayors and government. How will this affect the nature of polarization in Turkey? Related to this, what are the opposition's dilemmas in responding to this government strategy? And the next one is from Sonay Kamber, and it follows as, one observation of mine, whenever there is a controversy and or a public debate around Istanbul Metropolitan Municipality and Mayor İmamoğlu, visibly defends his position, we see Minister Soylu with the counter-argument on government's defense. Do you agree? If yes, why do you think this is the case? They are both directed to Emre.
Emre, can you respond?
Yeah, quickly, I will try to wrap up. Yeah, it's not about today's problem. It's about the elections of presidential elections of 2022 or 2023. Both mayors, Mansur Yavaş of Ankara and Ekrem İmamoğlu of Istanbul, are potential candidates against Erdoğan. We'll see. That's why the tension is based on this potential competition. It is not related with the resistance of localities because, yeah, the state has the responsibility of this fight against the coronavirus. It's related with the second question because Turkey has a very sophisticated state structure. The president of the republic is the head of the state. We changed the system, but we didn't change the essence. And that's why he's acting on behalf of the state, not only the government. It's something problematic. And from that perspective, the Ministry of Interior Affairs, Süleyman Soylu, has a power over the mayors. Mayors, they are not so autonomous. I personally believe that the strategy of the government is to show this hierarchy. For instance, instead of taking Ekrem İmamoğlu as a political competitor, they say, okay, this is not your place. They are trying to show his place in the hierarchy. And that's why there's a tension between these two localities, Istanbul and Ankara, vis-a-vis the government, because I personally believe that they are also competing with each other for the next presidential elections. This is political.
Emre, Lisel, did you want to weigh in on that?
I would agree very much. I mean, I think this is an opportunity, in a sense, for both İmamoğlu and Yavaş to kind of prove their political chops, and not just political chops, but sort of capacity and how they can actually deal with crisis and how they can try to provide services to people. But exactly as Emre said, they're hamstrung. They're not independent. They don't necessarily have all of the power to be able to control those decisions and fund allocations and things like that. I mentioned the donations issue before. Again, speaking kind of about viewing opposition as threats, it's clear, I think, that Erdoğan, if anyone, certainly sees İmamoğlu as a threat. He's taken over Istanbul, which was Erdoğan's sort of domain. It's where he made his own political career as mayor. And one of the things that İmamoğlu has done has been to try to get away from this identity polarization narrative that we've seen from a lot of other politicians, and the CHP's new radical love strategy, and the idea that we're going to try to develop a platform that is more inclusive and that we're not going to engage in very harsh political attacks and so forth. And again, we haven't seen that kind of language coming out of İmamoğlu, and he, I think, during his own election, smartly was focused on kind of trying to expose waste within the government in terms of money that was spent, how funds weren't allocated the way in which they were, and the way in which they should be, that they ended up lining some of the pockets of AKP members and political loyalists instead. I think that was a smart political strategy, and it's definitely turned into a competition between İmamoğlu and Erdoğan. Again, he doesn't have necessarily all of the resources at his disposal right now, but in terms of being able to try to provide for the municipality of Istanbul as best he can, I think he will be judged a little bit based on how he's able to do that. But again, he's not completely independent.
Great, thank you. Ceylan, back to you for the next question.
Thanks. And this one is from Haldun Solmaz Türk, and it follows. What about the political opposition? How effective and competent are they in fighting an openly aggressive government?
Emre, can you start us off with that response?
It's not easy because in that case, they had to deal with the state. And in Turkey, state was already powerful, and after the coup d'etat, it became more powerful. And it is not easy to fight against the state under these conditions. You cannot compete through your performance, okay? Because it's a nationwide issue. That's under control of the Ministry of Health. You cannot open hospitals, or you cannot provide a separate service to other people. You can try to improve your services, but it will be under the restriction of the state. It's not easy. They can wait. They can wait. It's not. There are some alternatives, of course. There could be some civil movements. I'm not talking about civil resistance or that kind of stuff, but that kind of solidarity networks, they could work. They could create a potential baseline for the next stage. But unfortunately, I don't observe any kind of these attempts. They are very limited, that kind of solidarity stuff. For them, they need to wait, and they need to wait for the next phase where they can compete with the party, not with the state.
Lisel, do you want to jump in on that as well?
Agreed. What can you do sometimes? Very, very limited space for opposition to unite, very limited space in the media. You know, yeah, what can you do sometimes?
Yeah, I mean, I think there will also be a moment in time, a few months down the road too, where things may clear up again for that to happen. And so much, I think what Andrew had said off the top, a lot of this is unknown. A lot of it is trying to figure out, reading the tea leaves of how these things fall out or impact politics now versus 6 months from now is going to be hard. Ceylan, back to you, because I know we have a number of questions, and we want to try to get them all in before our time is up today.
Christian Brakev has a comment. What Lisel mentioned earlier, the circular telling NGOs from holding online meetings, as far as we have been told by the ministry when asking them yesterday, this just does only relate to membership, board assemblies, and elections connected to it. And I will move to the next question. And it's from Jonathan Mayer. You mentioned a number of vulnerable populations or populations not supported by the government. Is there an indication of how this coronavirus response is playing out in heavily Kurdish areas or PKK prominent parts of Turkey?
Great. Thank you. That's a good question. And maybe we can, Lisel, we can start with you, and then we'll turn to Emre and Andrew too. Just, I'll bring you in too if you wanted to sort of either sort of just picking up on some of these other questions, if you want to just weigh in or comment from your perspective. But why don't we start there? Because I know, Lisel, you've talked about sort of different sort of groups that are vulnerable, and obviously, again, there was initial fault lines already in Turkey in these areas. So please weigh in and respond, and Emre will bring you in, and then Andrew as well.
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. I think it's a really insightful one, and one that needs a lot of research, and I don't have that research, and we haven't done it yet. So I don't have a good sense of how potentially disproportionately it is affecting Kurdish areas. What we might expect to see, again, is, in terms of populations that have larger, family sizes, populations that, have many people living together, depending on access to resources, their, access to healthcare and so forth, which is disproportionately lower in some parts of the Southeast, especially the rural areas. Then, that's a socioeconomic structural problem that's compounded by the identity polarization that put it there in the first place. So I think it's really worthy of investigation. What we do know is that the Kurdish Southeast has been disproportionately the target of the AKP's erosion of democracy. If you look at the number of pro-Kurdish HDP mayors who have been removed from their positions, I think there's only like a third of them left at this point from those who were elected in 2019. If you look at some of the electoral irregularities, those are disproportionately in the Kurdish Southeast. If you look at electoral violence, it's disproportionately against the HDP. So you're already seeing a number of circumstances that would expect or would lead us to expect that there is, a disproportionate effect of the corona pandemic in the Kurdish southeast. But I haven't done the research yet to be able to speak in any systematic way about that. But I think it's a really, really important research question.
Thank you. And Emre, just sort of understanding that maybe all the information doesn't exist yet because we're really in sort of a certain stage of this crisis. Just your observations as well in the Kurdish areas and communities and the impact of coronavirus.
Yeah, for instance, the figures show that this is related with more populated places of Turkey, especially Istanbul is the main place, to my knowledge, more than 20,000 cases. And it doesn't mean that Kurds, they are not affected by this pandemic, but as New York or other cosmopolitan cities, they have been more affected by the disease. This is similar in Turkey. Southeast region, this is relatively poor. It is highly rural, composed of very small villages, etc., etc. That's why it doesn't attract the national attention. But I know that there are too many cases there, anecdotally. And when we are talking about Turkey, generally we tend to talk about three large cities such as Istanbul, Ankara, Izmir, and we tend to forget what's going on the rest of the country. And as Lisel argued, there has been some malpractices from a democratic point of view about the local government, etc., etc. From that point of view, I don't personally believe that there is a huge difference between the west and the east of the country in terms of the effects of the pandemic. But within the cities, there may be such a problem because the poor people living more populated households, living in worse neighborhoods, they are more affected by the pandemic, and they are not under the umbrella of the state or something like that. There may be such a change, but we will see. We don't have exact figures.
I would just also note that Istanbul is the largest Kurdish city in Turkey. So,
Andrew, if you want, I just want to bring you into, because you've talked a lot about these divides that you're looking at between the haves and have-nots, rural cities, and so you can see some of this just in the responses, that were just made, how that's playing out, and this is not new to see some of these patterns, but just can you jump in on
Absolutely.
this topic?
To start with Jonathan's excellent question, first of all, I want to echo what was already said about the need for more information from a public health perspective. I think looking at the Southeast, another trend that will be very interesting to watch is whether these areas with lower state capacity and access to state services will also be areas where non-state actors take on a larger role in essential governance functions during this crisis. So this is one of the very interesting trends that we've seen globally, is that both formal organizations like community support groups, but also informal illegal organizations like militias and organized crimes have been stepping into the sort of need and the vacuum where state services are so desperately needed. So one very interesting example is Lebanon, where Hezbollah, the paramilitary organization, has reportedly mobilized 25,000 people, including medics, to combat the virus. Another is in Brazil, in Rio de Janeiro, where President Bolsonaro has not acted very swiftly, and drug trafficking gangs have in fact imposed a coronavirus curfew in many of the city's favelas and even been handing out soap. So I think that the Kurdish Southeast may be another place that sort of follows this trend, where we see formal or informal organizations stepping in at least some capacity to fill the really desperate need for public services. To echo another point that Galip mentioned about the opposition's dilemmas, I wanted to just briefly underscore the point that the opposition has very little formal power. And I think that in that regard, one of the key ways that the opposition will be judged, as Lisel was mentioning, is its ability to oversee corruption. Because this pandemic is through the sheer need to distribute tremendous amounts of stimulus funding when that's possible, but also public resources and triage those resources is going to expose tremendous opportunities for price gouging and other kinds of corruption. And I think that the opposition's key dilemma is how best to engage in that kind of oversight of corruption.
Andrew, thank you. And I'm glad you mentioned corruption as an issue. That's been something has been brought up before previously in Turkey with the current government. It was mentioned that one of the focus areas of the mayor of Istanbul coming in was to try to address those challenges of corruption. And I think we're even seeing here in the United States concerns about how the $2 trillion stimulus package is being spent when just over the last day or two, President Trump fired the inspector general, the key person who will be overseeing how that's going to be dispersed. So it's not only a challenge in Turkey, but also globally. And thank you for mentioning volunteers as well, because I think we're seeing mass mobilization of volunteers in spaces across both spaces like London, where they've had, I think, the largest mass mobilization of volunteers since World War II. We're seeing this in New York City as well. So there's other people are stepping up, volunteering at the non-governmental level. Jalen, back to you I want to make sure we get in. I think we have 2 more questions.
Yeah. Next one is from Andre de Monter from the European Parliament. Would any of the panelists elaborate on the accuracy, reliability of, for example, the figures on the number of deaths? Is there a breakdown between those who died in hospitals, retirement homes, migrant communities, and last but not least, prisons? I ask because this is relevant for the sake of transparency, not only in Turkey, but also in many other countries affected by the corona crisis, including my own country, Belgium, where, for instance, statistics are still lacking on how many of the causalities occurred in hospitals and how many in retirement homes, which would be essential information to fine-tune additional measurements.
Thank you. That's a really good question, and I think across the globe people are struggling to do this. Or also, there are some people who are likely suppressing information about coronavirus deaths, and I think you see this in a space like Russia, where they've underreported, or they've just called it death by flu or pneumonia. So let me, Emre, maybe can I just bring you in on sort of and maybe you don't have the statistics now, but statistics matter, and sort of understanding statistics matter, not only just for public knowledge now, but in the future, and responding to future pandemics if that does happen. And Lisel, you may want to weigh in as well.
Yeah, from that perspective, I personally believe that the picture is not different than other countries. Yeah, we are relying on official statistics. The government provides all the statistics, and we don't have any alternative method to collect this data. Not only about deaths, but also the number of affected cases. We cannot collect. For example, in Austria, I just heard that they conducted a research and they collected data, etc., etc. We don't have such a chance. We are relying on the official numbers. It's very important because in that case, the state has a monopoly on the facts. You cannot produce alternative facts. Of course, there are some statistics showing that the number of deaths is significantly higher in Istanbul this month and during March compared to the previous years. But we don't observe such a deviation in other cities. Since we don't have access to figures in every city, we cannot make that kind of comparisons, but we can find that kind of figures. Okay, there is this change. There's a significant deviation there, and it's very different than the official figures presented by the government. But we will rely on these figures. This is same. It happened in the same way in China, in other countries. Governments, they are reporting these figures in a way, and we are relying on these figures. They are not most reliable statistics I would like to use in this.
Lisel, do you want to jump in?
No, I would 100% agree with that, and I think it's very difficult, A, at this early stage, and also B, with the government, who has an extraordinarily vested interest in trying to, in any way that it can, show that it's controlling this in a proper manner, and so has an incentive to underreport. And here again, you have to look at the AKP stability. We don't have elections until 2023, possibly earlier. But with the economic situation the way that it is and how that has been exacerbated by the corona pandemic, the lira is in a very precarious state. You know, Erdoğan's message has been, to go back a little bit to the point about, you know, multilateral cooperation, his message has been, biz bize yeteriz Türkiye'm, like we're enough for ourselves, right? We're self-sufficient. We don't need international cooperation. And that seems to rule out the IMF. That may, and I think this might touch on a question that's coming a little bit later, but that may lead Turkey to turn more towards China in terms of economic cooperation and so forth. So again, when a country is, or when a party that's in power and is very, very worried about its stability is as concerned as it is, there is an incentive for underreporting, and you have to take that into consideration, as well as the fact that there are going to be communities that are disproportionately underreported, like migrant communities, as the question asker suggested.
Thank you. And I'm glad you sort of raised sort of that economic impact again, because I think in transparency, because part of the transparency will be for countries over the longer term, if you, and we see it in a number of spaces where potentially the macroeconomic, the economic response is to jump in with China or Chinese support potentially versus that of the IMF. The reason why is that the IMF has conditionality attached to its assistance and transparency to that assistance, and maybe Andrew's seeing this too, is that, you know, this ideas of you know, who can best support recovery economically. And for those politicians that are will likely be in a bind based on the economic situation, you know, who will they turn to, you know, for support? So Andrew, I just thought maybe you want to quickly jump on that, and then we're gonna, I think we have maybe one or two last questions that we hopefully we can get to.
Yes, just to respond briefly to the question from Andre, I would say that I would commend to you an article by Aslı Aydıntaşbaş in the Post, where she discusses in many ways how the government has explicitly been trying to stem the flow of information about the death rate. On the point about the economic bind that countries face, I think it's a little bit, again, early to tell. But what is clear, I think, is that this is exposing in many ways the sort of conflict between reliance on these conditionality-based institutions, as you suggested, like the IMF, and others like China that will be able to have a more open pocketbook in this sense. But I think that the scale of the crisis that we're witnessing bears significant, or sort of deserves significant attention in this regard. I think there is a tendency to see China as having sort of a blank checkbook. And I would just sort of push back on that and say that even for the IMF, this is a crisis with very little historical precedent. And that as a result, I think that China as a competitor will have a very stiff and difficult task ahead if it does want to compete with that kind of multilateral forum. So I would say that there are still significant advantages that these multilateral institutions have in terms of their resources.
Definitely, thank you for that. And I think it also just sort of a reminder for the United States, for European partners and others, that they need to be engaging with countries like Turkey on these macroeconomic issues, to provide options when it's possible, but also for Turkish officials as a reminder that there are longer term implications for signing up to deals with countries that may have strings attached. Ceylan, can we just turn it over to you? Maybe we'll try to get in the last. Maybe we can bunch together two questions, and then we're gonna maybe ask for closing thoughts from our panelists.
Mm-hmm. We have two final questions and a comment. I will just read them quickly. This is the first one is from Sarah Meneghetti, and it follows as, this is a follow-up from the Corona diplomacy question. I noticed from speaking to Europeans and in particular Italians that there is a generalized feeling of resentment towards the EU's alleged lack of action And on the contrary, there is strong praise towards China and Russia's efforts to assist Italy. Do you think there is a hidden agenda behind Russia and China's assistance? Will there be consequences to the temporary help they are providing? And the second question is from Mehmet Önol. My question is if the campaign Biz Bize Yeteriz would increase the polarization between different classes and different ethnic groups in Turkey. And there's one final comment from Haldun Solmaz Türk that Turkish Doctors Union is simply sidelined and kept out of the loop.
Great. Andrew, maybe you could answer, take a stab at the first question, and then we'll turn to Emre and Lisel to answer that last question.
Yes, Seren, I think this is an excellent question. And I think that it's very clear that China and Russia have been trying to use this sort of resentment towards the EU and other institutions in order to promote some sort of soft diplomacy. And I think that the focus or the research I've read on Chinese propaganda in particular has emphasized just how geared this is towards Western audiences.
Okay, thank you.
These kinds of initiatives are specifically geared towards generating.
Andrew, keep going. Sorry, I think I may have cut you off.
No, please, Emre, go ahead.
Yeah, okay. About this issue of Biz Bize Yeteriz, yeah, it includes a definition of us. And as Lisel stated, this is the basic logic of polarization. You need to define us, a collective identity. Some people will be included and some people will not be included to this identity, to this collective stuff. That's why I believe it will also polarize, because you will feel yourself excluded from this new identity, because it won't be limited with some basic facts. Okay, coronavirus doesn't recognize identities. We know it. But treatment you are getting, it depends on your identity. That's why you can feel yourself excluded. You can feel you and your friends, your family excluded from all these processes. There will be always some rumors that some people got more resources, they had access to better health services, etc., etc. As we already observed in social media, for example, some individuals had access to tests before the government, even before the government. They were linked with the government. Some of them were relatives of politicians, etc. Now you are starting to feel yourself as excluded, or you feel yourself unimportant on the eye of some people. It polarizes. That's the issue. Whenever you are talking about these us, you are creating some others. You are building some borders. Even though you can try to include everyone, you will exclude, as Lisa said, Syrians. You will exclude them. They are not registered. They are non-existent. They are not under the umbrella of health, etc., etc. They will be excluded, and there will always some people who will be excluded. You cannot create that kind of large umbrella, even under these very critical conditions. Yes, it will create some further polarization.
Lisa?
I would agree to that to a certain extent. I think that the them there is more the West. I feel like there's an attempt to try to portray Turkey coming together, to try to show the Turkish nation as united and strong, and therefore not beholden to or in need of any kind of Western support. So I think it was targeted a bit more there, but I 100% agree that anytime you create an us, there are those who feel excluded. So even, there are more divisive ways in which this rhetoric has been used, like yerli ve milli, so like local and national, which is very much saying Kurds are not part of that. But even with something like Milletin Adamı, like the nation's, the people's man, the nation's man, was not he was not the man of everybody. He was the man of those who supported him and voted for him. So that was in its, even though it sounds inclusive, it's actually quite exclusive. So I agree that any kind of identity rhetoric is going to create some kind of others, for sure.
Great. Well, I just want to, first of all, unfortunately, we've reached our time limit for today, and I want to just first and foremost thank everybody, our speakers, who were really excellent. I mean, this is a topic that deserves greater attention. I think you can understand the complexities of the moment. I think first and foremost, we hope for Turkey and for the Turkish public, in this period that their efforts to address the pandemic are as successful as possible. Obviously, lives are at stake, but also that the coronavirus itself not only is picking up, impacts polarization in new ways, but also exposes existing fault lines. And I want to thank everybody too for highlighting some of the deeper challenges to groups within society. I think somebody just brought up recently, just in sort of one of the comments, the Turkish Doctors Union, these are frontline workers who are saying they're having trouble in terms of their ability to respond or have the government respond. But what happens in Turkey and Turkey's response has an impact not only regionally, but globally on a number of topics. And we hope that in the coming days, we can come back to both our speakers and to the participants. There'll be another On Turkey series briefing next week, which we hope that you'll be able to participate in. But I think this conversation highlights the challenges, but also how important it is to shed light on these challenges, including whether it's democratization or need to address minority challenges. Lisel, thank you for pointing out domestic violence, numbers that are quite alarming, the roles of civil society, of politicians, of Turkey's partners as well, which I think we really hope that there will be a greater effort by Western partners to support Turkey and Turks during this crisis moment. And also thank you really just on the logistics side to several people who are involved in this. Ceylan, obviously Özgür, our fearless director of our Ankara office, GMEP's Ankara office, thank you, and John Alexander providing some additional technical support here in Washington. And I wish we could all give you sort of a round of applause to our speakers right now, as we typically do, but we're doing this virtually. And thank you so much. For those that want to refer back to the conversation, which I hope you will, there'll be a video link to the event. And thank you again so much for being here. Take care and please be safe. Lisel, Andrew, Emre, please be safe. Take care. Thank you.
Take care.